Don Shula, from John Carroll to the secondaries of the NFL to the top of the NFL, really, as the great coach of the Colts, is a long way to go.
Well, the only thing I can say is that I'm just so proud of our football team and our coaching staff and everybody connected with our organization, from Carroll Rosenblum, our owner, on down. And this didn't happen out there. It was a lot of hard work, a lot of frustration through the years. I think that our football team, since I've been here, has been disappointed more than any other football team has. We've played well, yet we've never reaped the harvest, and today is the day that we're going to relax and enjoy it a little bit. And I just think that we deserve to win. We've played well all year long, and today was the climax.
Don, Billy Nelson bought his offensive line steaks last week to get him to block. Are you going to buy this entire ball club champagne and steaks?
Yeah, we've got a little something planned tonight, and we're going to do a little buying and relaxing and celebrating, and well, they certainly deserve it. But we still got our eye on one more ball game, and that's going to be the 12th down in Miami, and we're going to be thinking a little bit about that after tonight.
Don, what about a ball club now? Let's say you've had disappointments, and you have. You lose one last year and you lose it all. You lose a playoff game to Green Bay once and you lost it all. How do you get them back and started again the next season? What do you
The thing that I've always stressed is that anybody that feels sorry for themselves and starts making excuses are losers, and we don't like to have losers around our winning people. And the thing that we've done is try to get it out of our mind. As soon as it's over with, last year it was tough when we got knocked out of it, but what good does it do you to moan and to bellyache about the thing? The only thing we try to do, our whole theme from training camp on, was to be better. And we wanted to be better than we were last year, and as it's turned out, we are better.
I remember last year at the Pro Bowl, I asked you what you needed, and you said just one more victory. That's
right.
All you wanted.
Yeah, we didn't win enough last year. We won a little bit more this year, and that's why we're here right now. And I'm just, again, so proud of our football players.
Don Shula, you didn't do any alibiing. When it was the bad times, you took them in stride, and you did bring this ball club on, and I think that might be the reason that the entire nation is so darn proud of you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you very much.
Don Shula, the head coach of the Baltimore Colts, and a great one.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hello there, everybody. How are you? Nice to see you again, or hear you again, or whatever. Touch base and be in your earbuds again. And we appreciate you giving us a listen in the wild and wacky world of podcast choices that you have available to you. And you no doubt know by now that you have stumbled into the podcast that we call Good Seats Still Available. Again, our curious little journey each and every week into what used to be in professional sports. And the little clip you heard there at the top of our little show is from the 1968 NFL championship game. And yes, that was the penultimate game before the end of the full season. That is the 1969 Super Bowl III, where the New York Jets, in a stunning and upset fashion, defeated the Baltimore Colts, who, at the end of this game, and you just heard Tom Brookshire behind the CBS microphones interviewing head coach of the Baltimore Colts, Don Shula, having just won and handily so against the Cleveland Browns. I think it was 34-0. The NFL title game, and of course that game was the title game for the NFL, and of course the prelude to what ultimately became the Super Bowl championship that they later lost in, again, stunning fashion. And that is the topic, not specifically that game or this season, but the Baltimore Colts of the 1960s, and in particular, a period of time during the 1960s when Baltimore, the Colts, were probably, with the possible exception of the Green Bay Packers, the most dominant and star-studded and successful teams in the National Football League. And we're going to be talking about, in particular, two of the brightest lights of that franchise and, let's say, some of the friction that came between them, that being head coach Don Shula and, of course, perhaps one of the greatest quarterbacks, maybe greatest players of all time, played for the Colts at that time, Johnny Unitas. And the discussion is the one that we're going to have about them, the Colts, and 1960s football. With our guest, Jack Gilden, he the author of Collision of Wills, Johnny Unitas, Don Shula, and the Rise of the Modern NFL. This is a fascinating tale, not just only about a team that doesn't exist in Baltimore anymore, the Colts, but two legends of the game. Don Shula, certainly as a head coach, but obviously a player beforehand. And Johnny Unitas, again, regarded by many as the consummate example of star material when it comes to NFL quarterbacks. And it's some very interesting stories and storylines that we get into with our guest, Jack Gilden, in a couple of minutes about sort of how these two legends got along or didn't get along and forged perhaps some of the best and most successful football of the era in Baltimore, playing for and coaching the Colts. And we're going to get into all of that in a couple of seconds with our chat with Jack in just a couple of seconds. Stay tuned. You're going to learn a whole bunch as I did. And this is a fascinating topic, a great conversation, and it's a hell of a book too, by the way. Let's get some promotional stuff out of the way before we get into it, shall we? I want to say thank you and hello to three of our awesome sponsors. They're all sports related. They all have really cool stuff for you to consider and to enjoy. And of course, we've got promo codes for all of them. And we highly encourage you to check out their wares now. Why don't you? Maybe you could pause the show and go visit these sites. First is oldschoolshirts.com. Oldschoolshirts.com. Our friend P.F. Wilson and team in Cincinnati. Great, high-quality, distressed T-shirts that just literally go back in the day with great logos and great remembrances of teams and leagues no longer with us, but also very cool cultural things like radio stations and shopping malls and other sort of paraphernalia, if you will, not paraphernalia, but memorabilia, if you will, or memories. There you go. It's been a long day, friends. Give me a break. And you will get lost in all of the cool logos and memories that Old School Shirts has for you. Oldschoolshirts.com. Check them out. And I think you're going to enjoy all that is to be had there, and some very fair pricing as well. And make sure you use that promo code GOODSEATS and get 10% off all of your purchases there at oldschoolshirts.com. Some really cool stuff. No Baltimore Colts stuff. I think the Colts logo is still pretty much the domain of the NFL and a little harder to kind of replicate. But I'm sure as heck you're going to find some other stuff there from other NFL teams no longer with us and AFL as well. As well, you will find at sportshistorycollectibles.com, I'm pretty darn sure, you're going to find some stuff from the old Baltimore Colts of the 1960s, but also just the entire history of that franchise. And sportshistorycollectibles.com, like the name implies, is the place to find all kinds of great memorabilia. There's the word I was trying to find for this one, where you're going to find buttons and T-shirts, not T-shirts, well, maybe some T-shirts, some clothing items, but pennants and buttons and media guides and various publications of yore about teams and leagues of yore. And they're all there for you at sportshistorycollectibles.com. Dean Mitchell and friends do a yeoman's-like job putting together really cool photography of these items. And they're just a marvel just to kind of click through and look at. But indeed, some of those items are going to be just too darn tempting to not own for yourself. And when you decide you're going to make that commitment, make sure you use the promo code that we've got there. Also, Good Seats. And you're going to get 15% off all of your purchases at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And I guarantee you'll find some cool stuff there and probably some cult stuff. So go for it and check them out. sportshistorycollectibles.com, promo code Good Seats. And one last one, our relatively new sponsors, who we love tremendously from Portland, Oregon, the beautiful part of that of our great nation that spawns the site 503 Sports, and that's 503-sports.com or 503-sports.com, depending on your persuasion, your grammatical inclinations. 503 Sports considers themselves, and I would argue they are absolutely this, the king of throwbacks. And not only do they have T-shirts with great logos and stuff, but also handcrafted uniforms, replica and painstakingly made from, kind of leagues and teams no longer with us, including things like in football, the XFL and the World League of American Football and, the USFL. You're going to find jerseys that are made with fine, not only craftsmanship, but also attention to detail in helping to bring back the memories of some of these great teams and leagues, or frankly, maybe not so great teams and leagues But man, oh man, this is going to make you stand out in the arena or at work or on the go. You should check them out. They're the king of throwbacks, we call them. And it's 503 Sports. 503, get it? That's the area code of the Portland, Oregon area. And their website is 503-sports.com or 503-sports.com. And yes, of course, we have a promo code for you there too. And that's the promo code SEATS, just the word SEATS. And you're going to get 10% off all of your purchases there at 503 Sports. Again, 503 hyphen or dash, you choose 503-sports.com. And we thank them for joining the growing array of sponsors here on this little show. We appreciate them and you checking them out. All right, we are going to now get into football, arguably one of the great decades of professional football. This time the NFL variety, but in particular the Baltimore Colts. And the two cogs, the key guys, sort of chafing and succeeding with those Baltimore Colts of the 1960s, Johnny Unitas and the coach, Don Shula, with our guest, Jack Gilden, Collision of Wills. That's the book. Here's our conversation. And the interest in the Colts of the 60s, and in particular the zone of such that we're going to get into. How does that come about? And your, shall we say, I guess, a determination to put it into what I think is a pretty strong, into not only a book, but a very strong historical context.
Well, I just was fascinated by that time period, and I was fascinated by that time period in football history, both. In my mind, it's the best era of professional football that there ever was. It's so many really great Hall of Famers, top shelf Hall of Famers playing in the 60s against each other. Plus you had the additional component of the war between the two leagues. So the football was certainly more than compelling enough. The story of Unitas and Shula came to me when I was still a teenager, a high school student, and I went to a journalism conference put on by the Baltimore Colts for high school students. And there was a famous old newspaper man that was there. His name was John Stedman, and he was one of the presenters. And he happened to mention offhandedly that Unitas and Shula didn't like each other. And I thought, well, that's so interesting because you take these two compelling men, both could make the case for being the greatest of all time, the greatest player, the greatest quarterback, and the other man is definitely in the conversation of the greatest coach. I guess a lot of people feel like Vince Lombardi is, but Shula won more games than any other coach. He went to 7 championship games, more than Vince Lombardi. He won. He won 2. He was the architect of the perfect season. So he certainly has his credentials for greatest coach ever, too. And I thought it's so interesting that these two were on the same team together, didn't like each other. They won with greater regularity than Lombardi's Packers. They had a higher winning percentage than Lombardi's Packers, but they couldn't win the big one. And so I kind of thought I'd look into that and try and understand what happened there. How do two men so great walk away after 7 seasons and not really achieve their ultimate goal? And I thought that's a pretty interesting story.
All right. So, what year was this encounter with this journalist and this little discovery, this little tidbit that he sort of offhandedly mentioned?
Oh, I guess if I was 15, that would have been around 1980, 1981, something like that. It was right at the very end of the Colts reign in Baltimore. I would soon be in college, and the Colts would soon be in Indianapolis.
So what then, before that sort of little magic spark of a moment, what did you think of, I guess, looking backward and maybe a little bit of knowledge, I guess, or maybe even some fandom there about not only the Colts but this. What was your perception of the relationship? That it was sort of this magical marriage of two, titans of the game, if you will. What was your original? What set you aback by that comment that they didn't get along with each other?
Well, I guess that they were so well associated with each other, and they were both so so great, you know, and their reputations were so gigantic in the league, and deservedly so. So it set me aback to think that they spent that much time together and didn't like each other. However, I was always a reader. I was also a football player. I was not a great athlete, and I was tiny, but I played 4 years of high school football, and I started off as a quarterback, and I began playing quarterback by reading everything I could about the greatest quarterback, the man that I considered to be that. So I read everything I could about Johnny Unitas, and I tried to understand what made him so great. So in doing all of that reading, I began to see the Colts of 1959, they quickly were no longer champions. Their coach, who was hailed as a genius over and over, was out of a job. And then Shula came in, and of course Shula was very famous at the time that I started playing football. He was still a king in the league, and he still had great teams. He was still a perennial Super Bowl contender, even though Zonka and Warfield and those guys had moved on. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what happens in that situation? First of all, how did the Colts of 58 and 59, that might have been the greatest team ever assembled, how did they slip from being so great to all of a sudden not being great anymore? What happens in a situation like that? So that intrigued me. And then I started looking into the next situation, and you looked at all of the great players, the layers of great players on those Colts teams, the great records they had, and I really was intrigued by the idea of, you know, what happened there? How is it that they didn't get where they wanted to go? In Baltimore, the mythology was that they were merely a hard luck team, that they had terrible luck in the 60s, and that's what got them. In Baltimore, to this very day, to anybody who cares, to any real football fan, they talk about Super Bowl III like it was this horrible fluke and it wasn't possible. And you play them 10 times, and the Colts would beat them 9 times, and and things like that. So I knew that there was like a hard crust of mythology on all of this that was obscuring the truth. So I decided I would go in and look for the facts myself and determine what the truth was. How did they lose their footing after the 50s, and what happened in the 60s that prevented them from winning the title?
Well, why don't we start there, sort of in the late 50s, right? And I probably the obvious sort of place that I suspect that you probably started, or at least circled on your little journey there, was their first NFL championship in 1958, otherwise known, right, as that greatest game ever played. The greatest game, right. Well, I didn't want to circle it too much because it had been so overly covered by people who viewed it with their own 2 eyes and ears, and they knew it better than I did. Even David Halberstam was working on a book about that game when he died. Mark Bowden had recently written a great book about the 58 championship game. My own mentor, a great newspaper man here in Baltimore, a guy that I idolize named Michael Olesker, he had written a lot about the Colts of the 50s. So I tried not to obsess on them so much because everybody kind of knew their story through the eyes and ears, but instead my focus on the 50s was what went wrong. How did they go from being that back-to-back champion, that crusher, to all of a sudden not having it anymore? How does that happen to a team is where I began. All right, so tell us then about that, right? So I guess you're talking about 1960, right? Because they won 1960, correct. 2 championships back to back, as you mentioned, 58 and 59. Maybe right. That's maybe where the story kind of picks up or starts, right?
Yeah, kind of. It actually starts much earlier in the early 50s when Unitas and Shula are teammates. But let's come back to that for a second. And let's talk about how they lost it as a team, because that's a very interesting story. And I've been interviewed by a lot of people, but nobody's really asked me about that yet. So it might be something nice for your listeners to hear, which was that what happened there was that the Colts almost really were almost destroyed by their own success in a way. So Unitas was so cinematic, so theatrical in that 58 championship game. He was outthinking everybody, and one particular man really took notice of it. And that man was so intrigued by what Unitas was doing that he wanted to get into the game of football too. And that was Lamar Hunt. He watched the game, I believe, in a hotel room somewhere, and he was really intrigued by what those guys were accomplishing. So he wanted to get into football. He tried to get an NFL franchise, and they wouldn't give him one. And so he started the AFL with some other investors that he got together. So in a very short span of time, he put that league together. So when that league came together, they had their own draft separate from the NFL draft in 1960. Was their first draft. And Weeb Ewbank at that time knew that the Colts were getting old in certain ways and they needed new component parts. And now this is either the 1960 draft or the 61. You're going to have to forgive me because I don't have the information in front of me. But in one of those two drafts, it was either the first AFL draft or the second. In 1960, Alan Amici, the Colts' great fullback, tore his Achilles tendon. And so the Colts' great running game, the Colts were definitely well on their way to a third championship in a row. They were crushing the league when Amici went down. But when he did, it exposed the Colts. And the defenses no longer had to worry about their running game anymore. So they were teeing off on Johnny Unitas, and they're getting a lot bigger jump on the pass rush, and they knew that the Colts had to rely on him to throw in order to win, and the Colts came limping out of that season. They barely survived it, and they didn't end up winning the division, and I think they lost their last 4 games in a row after a brutal game in Chicago. So then what happened is in the next draft, they were looking for new component parts. Amici retired because of that injury, and so they drafted Ron Mix, and he was a great tackle. And they drafted what's the name of that great running back in Dallas in the 1960s? Can you think of his name? He was the Cowboys' first great running back.
Oh boy, now you got me.
Yeah, it's jumped out of my head, but if we said his name, you would recognize it. All of your listeners would recognize it. But the Colts also drafted him late in the draft, like in the 7th round or something like that. So he went on to become like the 3rd leading rusher in NFL history. But because the Cowboys were coming into the league and fighting an AFL team in the Dallas market, the league gave them this great running back. I wish his name wasn't jumping out of my head at the moment. So the Colts lost that running back. Ron Mix signed with the Chargers instead of the Colts. And then I think the Colts' other next 3 draft picks, 3 or 4, all signed with AFL teams as well. And so the Colts were being stingy with the money because they were never in a situation before where they had to worry about it. And to them, they were arrogant. They believed that great players were their divine right and that they didn't need to sign these players. Well, most of these guys ended up as AFL All-Stars, and Mix ended up in the Hall of Fame, and the running back they needed went walking off to Dallas because the NFL gave it to that franchise and only compensated the Colts with another 7th-round pick or something like that. So a gigantic amount of talent went walking out the door in that very next draft, just as the Colts needed it the most. And so the Colts general manager, he was compensated with a bonus for turning a profit, and so he wasn't about to get in a bidding war with the AFL for the players. He could care less. So that played a big role in those guys leaving and going to the AFL instead of signing with the Colts, and that was the genesis of the Colts going downhill. At the exact same time, the Packers under Lombardi, they were owned by the city and not by an oligarch like the Colts owner, Carroll Rosenblum, and their mandate was to spend the money on the players. So the Packers, even though they were in the smallest market, weirdly had the most money to sign players. And they had a genius in their front office a guy named Jack Van Easy, who had been picking great players for them for years, but they were going undeveloped. So bringing in both Lombardi to develop them and having the money to sign them when the wars set in with the AFL, the Packers ascended with talent and the Colts started to lose talent. And that was how the big change in power, the big shift in power in the NFL happened. That's how it went from the Colts to the Packers. People think, oh, Vince Lombardi was a miracle worker. He was like Moses, he parted the Red Sea. But it wasn't like that. There were tangible reasons why he ascended and why Ewbank fell back. And so, 3 years later, Lombardi went to 3 championship games and won 2 of them, and Ewbank was fired, and it was really humiliating for him. Not only did he get fired by the Colts, but nobody else in the league had wanted him, and the Colts dynasty was dead. And that was how it happened.
Well, so this is okay. So then, as this sort of is playing out, tell us about how Don Shula comes into the mix, and maybe before doing so, you can go back to your earlier point of reference, which I didn't even know.
That they were teammates.
Shula and Johnny Unitas for 1 year were actually teammates on the Baltimore Colts.
That's correct, and not only that, but Shula was very popular with his defensive teammates, and one in particular, a guy named Gino Marchetti, who was about the greatest defensive end who ever lived. So he was good friends with those guys, and Shula himself was a pretty good cornerback, halfback, as they used to call him in that time in the league, a defensive halfback for several years. I think for 2 of his years with the Colts, he averaged 5 interceptions per season, and he was a pretty good player, but he was not a good athlete. And he was the quarterback on defense and called the plays for the Colts, and he would call the plays to a certain extent to set himself up to succeed. So he knew how to position himself. He was very smart, and he was successful in that way. Well, when Unitas and Raymond Berry came onto the team, they were both total nobodies. Berry was a very late pick, like an 18th round pick or something crazy like that. Had almost no stats in college. He played defense as much as offense in college. He definitely wasn't a defensive end in the NFL. They knew that. But Ewbank was just almost a genius level talent evaluator, and he saw something in Berry. He also saw something in Unitas that nobody else saw. Everybody thought, well, that was a miracle that he pulled it out of his rear end. He found this guy off of a sand lot, and he turned out to be so great. Well, in reality, they knew he was coming. They had spoken to his college coach. Weeb was very well connected with college coaches and NFL coaches, and he was always getting information from all of these guys. And so Unitas' old coach at Louisville had called the Colts and said, look, Weeb, this guy Unitas is going to come for your tryout day, and said, don't discount him. The Steelers never gave him a chance. I coached him in college, and he's really, really good. And then as soon as they got there, they could see that guy knew what he was talking about. So we put Berry and Unitas off to one side together, had them practice together, and then their own work ethics and their innovative ideas came to the table, and they were really, developing incredible timing together. And then they're lining up against Shula every day in practice, and all of a sudden they start to light him up, and they're connecting on passes over his head, and everybody could see that Don Shula didn't really have it as a defensive back in a more modern NFL. He didn't quite have the speed to exist in that world, let alone against these 2 brilliant guys who had this weird chemistry with each other. So that was the beginning of the end for Shula. He eventually got cut. The rumor was he was so pissed that he put on sunglasses and had to walk past the entire team when he was cut. And he walks out to his car, and he gets in there, and instead of going home, he drives around the Baltimore Beltway over and over again to avoid going home and to blow off steam. But the players all thought he was going to come back and punch Ewbank in the nose. So he resurfaces with the Redskins that same season, and the Colts happen to play the Redskins that season, and they really lit him up in this game. Berry had 250 yards receiving. It was the first big game of his career. He had 2 touchdowns. And I said to Shula, I sat on his personal sofa and said, what happened in that game? He said, I vowed that they would not get any big long gainers over my head. I said, so what happened then? He said, well, they completed quite a few right in front of me. And that was an understatement. So there was kind of that component to the Unitas-Shula relationship right off the bat, where they were adversaries and they were both hungry for success, and they were fighting each other for it, and one far outshone the other. And so then when Shula, after that performance, Shula was out of football for good as a player at the end of the year. He was only 26 or 27 years old, and he started his career as an anonymous assistant coach. I think he went to Virginia at first, and then he ended up with Blanton Collier in Kentucky, and then he ended up as the defensive coordinator of the Detroit Lions and re-entered the league.
So going back to that year that they were essentially teammates, what, aside from sort of the back and forth of an offensive unit versus a defensive unit in practice, and sort of the hard knocks, and obviously the talent of a Unitas against a Barry and maybe a waning talent in Shula on the defensive side, was there any evidence that you could tell of any personal connection and or animosity between the two specifically, or was this more of just a part of the overall sort of training and
Well, you had to read between the lines to figure it out, because nobody really wanted to come right out and say that existed, especially from that mundane reason. We're professionals, we don't even think about who we're lining up against. I heard things like that, and so you had to read between the lines. So on the one hand, Raymond Berry would say, oh, no, I didn't even realize I was lining up against Shula. But on the other hand, he's saying, oh, well, these two were the most off-the-chart competitors I'd ever seen in my, 50-some years of professional football, because he was a coach for many, many years after his playing career ended. So these were the two most competitive men I'd ever met in football. So you can imagine, they're lighting him up. You heard how he had to put on the sunglasses. He rode around the Beltway. Everybody thought he was such a red ass. He was so pissed he's going to come back and punch the head coach in the nose. There was clearly, they were rubbing each other the wrong way. They were competing, and they were rubbing each other the wrong way. There's just no doubt about it.
All right, so how does Shula enter the picture as a head coach? Because if I'm not mistaken, when he joined the Colts in '63, this was is this correct? Do I have this correct? This was his first pro football head coaching job.
It was his first head coaching job at any level. And was never even so much as a peewee head coach. So he entered the picture in this way. So you think of ethnic rivalries in the old days as being primarily black people and white people, or Gentiles and Jews, or maybe Irish and Italians fighting each other in New York or something like that. But the Colts team had an ethnic rivalry between Protestants and Catholics. And Ewbank was Protestant, and Marchetti and the two other defensive players were also Catholic, and Ewbank felt that they had it in for him, and they were bad-mouthing him back to Rosenblum and lobbying to get him fired, and the guy they wanted to hire was another Roman Catholic, and that was Shula. So when they presented the idea of hiring Shula to Rosenblum responded, he said, "You mean that guy that was here that wasn't very good?" And that was how he had remembered Shula. So, but the reality is that Shula was really distinguishing himself as a defensive coordinator with the Lions. I think it's 1962, the Packers had one of the greatest seasons any team had ever had. They led the league in offense, led the league in defense, both with numbers that were historical. And they only lost one game all season, and that was to the Detroit Lions. So in the first game, they played each other twice a year because they're in the same division. And in the first game, the Packers never scored a touchdown against Shula's defense, even though they had this juggernaut offense. I think they beat them 9-7 or something like that. And in the second game, in the second game, the Packers did score a touchdown, but the Lions beat the Packers and were the only team to do so all year. And I think the Packers were only able to get one touchdown in that game. So Shula was showing that he could solve Lombardi's offense. And then when he was playing the Colts, they were beating the Colts regularly. The Detroit Lions were beating the Colts regularly, and Johnny U was having terrible games against Shula's defense. So he was showing that he could solve Unitas. He was showing that he could solve the Green Bay sweep. And so he really was distinguishing himself. But again, the mythology is that he just came out of nowhere, this young 33-year-old kid, that Rosenblum was a genius who just knew how to make the right moves, and Shula came out of nowhere to be head coach. But in reality, he was a very, very fine defensive coordinator, and if you followed the league, you knew it.
So why do you think Rosenblum decided to take that chance? I mean, he's quoted as saying, he was going out on a limb to take somebody, a coach in Shula, so young and so unproven, albeit, helping the Lions on the defensive front for sure, in a quite standout way. Still quite a big risk for a guy, Rosenblum, right, who had seen the Colts, I don't know if he owned the team at the time, the 58, 59, winning championships and stuff. I mean, and that little toss away comment, right, that, Shula wasn't all that great a player. Well, what do you think tipped the scale towards Shula versus, I would imagine, a pretty decent amount of talent out there otherwise in the coaching ranks?
I think there's no one silver bullet answer to your question, but there are a lot of factors that lead up to it. So, for instance, Rosenblum did seem to be fearless when it came to making decisions. He hired Ewbank when Ewbank was a young assistant coach and unheralded. Everybody on Paul Brown's coaching staff, everybody assumed that Blanton Collier was the star assistant, and in fact, Rosenblum tried to hire Blanton Collier, but Collier didn't want to come to the Colts. So then he set his sights on Ewbank. He ended up getting him through a series of manipulations, and Ewbank really, in my opinion, he turned out to be, I would put my vote to him as the greatest coach of all time for a lot of reasons. So Rosenblum was fearless, and he made smart decisions. I don't know how he did it or where his intelligence about football came from. He played football himself in college, but he had a knack, and so he plucked Weeb Ewbank out, brought him on, and he turned out to be great. At the time that Weeb left, Weeb had 3 lackluster seasons in a row that may not have been totally his fault, but the fans were on him. Unitas, his career, again, here's another mythology of Johnny U. He wears armor, he's unassailable, but he had 3 bad seasons there, really. And in fact, his interceptions were pacing his touchdown passes, and in some cases outdistancing his touchdown passes. So he really had become almost mediocre in a way, and at least statistically speaking. And so, and then Weeb had also infuriated the fans because in trying to finally solve the running back problem that was plaguing them, he took Lenny Moore out of his role as a flanker and made him a halfback, a full-time halfback, and the fans were infuriated by that because he was such a weapon in the passing game. Super fast. He had numbers in the 50s and in the 60s like Megatron had in the long after the rules changed. So he was really a great receiver. And so we traded Big Daddy to get Jimmy Orr from the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Orr was a great player, a real find. And he moved Lenny Moore to halfback, and it was such a brilliant manipulation. It was really an intelligent problem-solving exercise, but it enraged the fans. And so a lot of things started to stack up against Weeb. The team was basically a 500 team for about 3 years in a row, and so his fate was sealed. And then Shula, as I said, was distinguishing himself, and the players on the team were really advocating for him, and so that was how it all came together. Interestingly, the one mistake Rosenblum made, though, was not really thinking how the chemistry between Shula and Unitas might be, given that they were basically the same age and and had been teammates and competitors, and it never really occurred to him to look into that one aspect, and that was the real undoing of the whole thing.
So that's interesting, and I maybe helps inform sort of the conversation as we take it further. They were basically the same age, and here you are, a player who in Unitas, right, who was quite well regarded, maybe having a rough patch, but as we'll talk about in a minute, reclimbs the mountain, so to speak, and then some on what ultimately became a Hall of Fame and very legendary career with a young coach, right, who has very, little background, right, certainly as a head coach, and a mediocre player at that. So maybe a little description of what your sense of their initial, I guess, reunion was like.
It wasn't good. Wasn't good, and right off the bat, it was bad. Shula was constantly sticking his face in the huddles to listen to Johnny U call the plays. He expanded the playbook, and the nomenclature of the plays was very, very confusing and long-winded. And he didn't trust Johnny U's the whole fame was really made, more than his arm, was made with his brain and as a great play caller. And Shula, right from the beginning, didn't really trust him to call the plays. He wanted to be the principal play caller from the sidelines, like Paul Brown had been. And so there was that really giant tension between them. And then to exacerbate it, in the very first game they ever played together as coach and quarterback, it was what was then called an exhibition game, a preseason game in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And the Colts played the Philadelphia Eagles, and they were beating them by something like 5 points with time running out. Unitas had to only hand the ball off to a running back and run the clock out, and the Colts would win the game. But instead, the Eagles cornerback taunted Johnny U and kept taunting him and telling him to throw the ball at him. And so Johnny U took the bait, heaved up a long pass to Jimmy Orr in front of this guy, and he picked it off and just ran to within like about 10 or 5 yards of the end zone, the winning score, before Jimmy had followed him all the way down and tripped him up before he could score and preserve the victory. And it was only a preseason game, but you could see it was the roots of mistrust between those two.
All right, we're going to take a quick little break here, and we got to pay some bills, and we want to thank our friends at MyBookie for helping us pay some of those bills. It's football season, friends, and as you know, football is probably the most exciting and most wagerable sports there is, whatever, you know what I'm talking about. And there's no better place to experience some of that wagering fun and good lines and payouts than MyBookie. MyBookie.ag, that's the actual website to go to. And we want to encourage you to give it a try, because if you use the promo code SEATS with your initial deposit, you're going to get matched dollar for dollar up to $1,000 for your initial deposit. That basically means $2,000 for the $1,000 that you put in, if you do the maximum, to use for your betting purposes, right? And you want to bet on any game, National Football League, it's college football, all kinds of other sports, both domestic and international. You can try your luck at betting with MyBookie, MyBookie.ag, and you're going to use that promo code SEATS, and you're going to get dollar for dollar matching for your initial deposit, all the way up to $1,000. And there's no lack of excitement now that sports gambling is effectively legalized here in the United States. It's going to be a very interesting experiment. And again, unfortunately, you're not going to be able to bet on any of the games and the teams and the leagues that we talk about on this little show. But let's assume that you don't always live in the past, and you do live in the present, and you've got an inkling, you've got a hunch, you just know that a certain team, hell, even fantasy points and scenarios are bettable at MyBookie. So give that a try. And again, if you're looking at a game you just think you just got an inside track on, MyBookie is the place to go at mybookie.ag. And make sure when you sign up, again, use that promo code SEATS, and they're going to match your initial deposit dollar for dollar up to $1,000. And we encourage you to give them a try and enjoy the extra dollars on us. And good luck as you make your way through the NFL and college football seasons. We wish you the best. MyBookie, that's mybookie.ag, and we thank them for their support of our little show. And of course, we go back to our conversation right now. So, delving into those roots, right? So, do you think this was Unitas disrespecting Shula in that Unitas was, I think by all accounts, the better, more superior and long-lasting player? Or do you think this was a bit of Shula kind of saying, you know, you're disrespecting me because even though we're about the same age and we're former teammates, you know, for better or for worse, I'm the coach here. And the relationship is that, you know, the coach runs the team, not the quarterback.
Well, I don't know if disrespecting is exactly the right word, although I know why you use it, and everybody might see it that way. But it was a little bit more complex than that. For instance, Shula described for me himself what it was like to be Johnny U's coach. He was like, well, here was a guy who knew our offense better than anybody in the world. I mean, he knew it inside and out. He was a thoroughly prepared player. He really knew everything about that Cleveland offense that we ran. But it was my job to go in and kind of say, well, I want to do things this way, and this is the way we're going to do it. And I had to be super prepared myself for every meeting that I went into with him, and I had to try and convince him that the things that I was advocating for were going to really help the team. So you could see that you're talking about, I don't know, 50 some years later, 60 years later, and he can still remember the discomfort he felt walking into a room with the guy when he first started coaching him. So it wasn't disrespect so much, but there was just this unease and this weird balance of power between them that went back to their pecking order as players, and also how they viewed themselves currently. Tom Matty, the running back, said, well, Shula viewed himself as the head coach of the team, but Unitas viewed Shula as the head coach of the defense and himself as the head coach of the offense.
That's
so.
I get that. Okay, so
that's how they saw it, right?
So that's a.
So I said that to Shula, by the way. I used that exact expression with him, and he has an old man. He's like 85 years old, and it still made the hair on his neck stand up to hear that. I felt uncomfortable even saying it to him, because it's so preposterous. There's the winningest coach in history, and then here I am telling him that one of his players said, well, the most famous player that ever played for him didn't view him as the head coach. He viewed him as the head coach of the defense. He didn't like hearing that at all, as you can imagine.
Well, based on your research and your conversations, give us a sense of the 63 first season of the two of them together, and what seems to me, I don't know if it's a dramatic transformation, but 1964, right, which seems like everything clicked, and both of them, ironically, winning player, most valuable player and most valuable coach together on that team in 64. So 63, how does it go? Is it sort of mutual coexistence or peaceful coexistence?
Well, no, I don't think so.
64, would you say?
Yeah, well, here, let me explain what happened. So in 63, I don't think it was so peaceful, and I think it was a really scary year for both of them because they started off playing really poorly, and Lenny Moore was a big factor in it because they were really counting on him to revive that running game. He had terrible concussions, concussive symptoms, and couldn't play, and they were very, very unsympathetic to his problems. They were calling him trade bait, and they were questioning his will to work and to win, and Lenny himself felt that it was all very racist. He thought there were racial overtones to the very idea that he would be considered lazy or not trying, and that they didn't care about how he was feeling. And it affected the team results. And I can't remember, I'm not looking at any stats in front of me, but they started off very poorly. one of the things that happened was that Shula kind of created the idea that we're going to win first down. And to him, winning first down, I guess, was getting 4 yards or more by running the football and then making it easier for you to get that first down, after that. And so he really tried hard to resuscitate that running game, and there were good running backs on the team. So besides Lenny Moore, including Tom Matty, who was, I believe, a rookie that year, and others. They made the trade for Joe Don Looney, and they had other young players. Weeb left the team stocked with talent. So it started off poorly, and Unitas loved the pass. Shula wanted to have a run-first offense and reestablish that. And eventually, they did really reestablish that running game. And by the season's end, the Colts had finished in third place again, where they had the year before. They won one game more with Shula than they had the previous year under Ewbank. And they looked like a contender again. It all turned around for them. And Unitas' statistics were vastly better. He had something like half the interceptions that he'd had the previous season, and you could see they were going in the right direction. But under the surface, there was the tension between them. And then in 64, the tension seemed to be totally gone because they were so successful all the way through it. They were just winning from day one. They beat the Packers twice. I can't remember how many games they lost. I think 2. I think one was to Minnesota or something like that. They probably beat the Bears twice. I can't remember, but they just plowed through that schedule. They killed everybody. And then they get to that championship game, and everything fell apart for them in that game where they were gigantic favorites against the Browns. They end up losing 27-0, and it was hailed as the biggest upset in the history of the league up to that point.
Yeah, but still, individual accolades for both Shula and for Unitas that year.
Yeah, oh yeah. Well, it was a great season, and again, though, like that Browns game was considered a fluke. But right in the very aftermath of it, what happened so the Colts lose 27-0. They had put terrible performances on offense and defense. But Shula says to the New York Times, "Well, we sure found out about their defense, didn't we?" Well, the Browns had the lowest ranked defense in the league, but they shut out Unitas, and so the New York Times took that as he was taking a slam at Johnny U, and they said so right there. And they also quoted an unnamed coach who said, well, the real problem was that team was very poorly prepared. Well, I can't prove it, but I think that unknown coach was Vince Lombardi taking a shot at Shula. So, all of these simmering tensions of these 2 seasons really came together there, and they kind of popped out after that embarrassing loss in that game.
So the day-to-day, or sort of the mechanics, as we sort of segue sort of halfway through this process, 1965 in a second, you mentioned before sort of the one feels like he's sort of the owner and the overseer of the offense, and the other maybe perhaps defined or being considered as maybe the sort of the defensive genius. But how would you sort of describe over these years sort of the manner in which these two are working together? Because arguably on some levels, right, this is working now, certainly circa 64.
There's no doubt it's working. No doubt about it. And 63 too. Like I said, Unitas's vicissitudes have been reversed. His interceptions went way down, and he looked again like the best player in football, even though he wasn't the MVP that year. I think Y.A. Tittle was probably. Can't remember, but you could clearly see that he was Unitas again. He was looking really, really good again, and the team looked like it was, the way it played in the second half of the season, it looked like it was a title contender again going into 64. So there was definitely a détente between them, and I'm sure that the peace was kept by that success. That Unitas's career was improving, his statistics were improving, and the team was ever so slightly improving. So it created a certain détente, but that Band-Aid was ripped off after that 64 championship game.
So let's an interesting little asterisk that I want to get into because we never really explored this before, but this is pretty interesting and it's important because in 65 and 66 the Colts were part of this. Obviously, both seasons quite good and arguably near or at the top, right? So, for example, in 66, finishing second to the Packers, but then but not winning or going into that sort of final sort of game is this thing called the Playoff Bowl. Do you want to explain this little interesting quirk in NFL?
Yeah, the Playoff Bowl was a terrible idea. It was a stupid idea. I guess they probably just came up with it to make money. But it was, in those days, they had two divisions. They had the East and the West, and that made up the entire NFL at that time. And so they would have, at the end of the season, the winner of the East would play the winner of the West for the championship of the NFL. And then they had this thing called the Playoff Bowl, which was the second-place finisher, and each division would play each other in this game. And I guess they felt that the fans would find it intriguing, and it would be another payday for them on television and at the box office. And so that's where it came from. The players called it the Toilet Bowl. They thought it was embarrassing. Nobody wanted to play in that game.
Yeah, interestingly, but I look at some of the attendance figures, and it was, like, for example, the 65 game in the Orange Bowl was, I think, a packed house to watch Baltimore play that sort of game against the Dallas Cowboys. There was like 65, almost 66,000 people there.
I didn't examine those statistics like you did, but I think it's a good sign of what the rest of the book is about, the rest of the title about the rise of the modern NFL. They were seeing that whatever they were throwing out there, the fans were eating it up. And for good reason, because, wouldn't you be intrigued to see Tom Landry and those Cowboys play against Don Shula and Unitas and those Colts? Those would be great games to see. But they made no sense from a competitive point of view, because why would anybody want to play for third place? It's just, with no chance at all to play for first or second place. It's just a ridiculous notion. But you can see that the fans already, that obsession was beginning, and that love of everything to do with football. I think now there are most preseason NFL games are capable of pulling in bigger numbers than the World Series, and that's the beginning of it.
All right. Well, so take us through the rest of this overlap of these guys playing and working with each other. 66, 67, 68. Pretty strong and reliable franchise, right? On both on the field as well as in the coaching side of things. Baltimore was essentially, a tried and true power, if you will, for most of these years. Correct?
Yeah, look, Shula was in Baltimore for 7 years, and if you throw out the first year as a mulligan and you throw out the last year as an anomaly because it was all falling apart, you have the 5 years in the middle of that sandwich, and they averaged 2 losses per year over those 5 years. 2 losses over 5 years. I don't think that Belichick and Brady have ever done anything like that, or I don't think Bart Starr and Lombardi had ever done anything like that. In 67 and 68, 2 of those 5 years, they averaged 1 loss per year. 1 loss per year for 2 years in a row. I think nobody had done that since one of George Halas's monster teams in around the World War II era before. So they were achieving historic things. But I want to point out one thing to you. You talk about 67 and 68, but the real key to understanding the greatness of the Colts and maybe even some of the tensions and the psychology is the 1965 season, because it was, in my opinion, and I think I say something like this in the text of the book, it was the apex of professional football. It hit its highest moment in that season, and it's never been quite as good ever again. And so do you want to hear the story of that season?
Yeah, and also maybe also context too. How much of that is the AFL playing in parallel, would you say, to that statement? That
created that great season?
Yeah.
Is that what you're asking? That how much did the AFL have to do with it? Yeah. I think the AFL had a lot to do with it. It's just like any other situation where there are competitors. I think that the NFL felt that need to assert its dominance over the game, and I think within the NFL you had incredibly hot rivalries. That Lombardi-Shula rivalry was incredibly good. I don't think that there's anything like the Colts and Packers rivalry of the 60s in the NFL today. Now, you could look at a great rivalry like the Ravens and the Steelers have had in the last 10 or 15 years, and it has been a fantastic rivalry. But when you look at the Colts and Packers and you look at all the Hall of Famers on the field and in the sidelines, and there's just nothing like it. It's an incredible array of historic, legendary players clashing with each other and really creating the game through those clashes. Not just playing the game, but creating the game, creating the fan interest in the game. It was all happening on those fields. So there's just nothing. I don't think before it or since it, there's never been a rivalry to match that one.
Well, and it probably came to an example, what's the word I'm looking for? The ultimate sort of expression, I guess, of that was this December 26, 1965. Don't call it a playoff game, right? It was essentially a tiebreaker for to decide who won the Western Conference in the NFL.
The West, right? Yeah, it sure was. And in fact, they did call it a playoff game. And I guess that's where the expression the playoffs come from, because the idea was it was a one-game playoff that would decide who the champion of the division was. And I think that's really where that expression comes from. And so they played that one-game playoff, but it was an incredible series of events leading up to that game, and it riveted the nation. It really showed just how exciting and unpredictable professional football was. So basically, the Colts and the Packers were neck and neck the entire season, and then as they got late into the season, the Bears, who were just brutal to the Colts, and one of the Colts claimed they had bounties out on Johnny U every year. They cracked his leg or, his knee or something in Chicago, and he had to be limp. He was taken off the field limping. I think Shula was under one of his arms, taking him off the field, and then it all started to unravel somewhat for the Colts. They were really worried, and they were ahead of the Packers the whole season. They looked like they were going to repeat, but now with Unitas getting injured, all of a sudden everything started to go back in the direction of the Packers. The Packers beat the Colts with Unitas's replacement in there, and a guy named Gary Quazzo. And not only did they beat the Colts, but they really hurt Quazzo very, very badly. He was a young guy from the University of Virginia, and he was thought to be the best backup quarterback in football. And he made a terrible call on one play. He called a play when the Colts were getting near the end zone. They're going to score just before halftime and take the lead, and he faked a handoff and instead tried to pass it in, and the Packers smelled it out. They ended up intercepting the ball and taking it all the way back almost to a touchdown. I think not Bart Starr, but the Packers ended up putting it in. Yeah, it was Bart Starr. Put it in the end zone very quickly from there. And so the Colts went from having a lead to being, way behind in the span of a couple of seconds. So then after that, the Packers had a little bit of a lead on them. They injured Quazzo in that game and took his shoulder out, and it was too late for the Colts to get a backup who could play in the postseason. So they started training Tom Matty, the backup halfback, to be the quarterback, and they had to go with him. And he's basically running the ball from the quarterback position and handing it off and barely throwing it, and they're winning. And they won well enough to tie the Packers. The Packers improbably lost, and they ended up in that tie situation, and they have this one-game playoff. And that was really just riveting to the country. These two unbelievable teams, this improbable situation, and they end up going for this one-game playoff with Unitas on the bench and a halfback that no one knew, assuming his position. So in that game, the Colts basically beat the Packers, and the Packers went down to get to try a tying field goal. They had a very good field goal kicker named Don Shula. He missed it. You can see it on the tape, on the film to this day. It exists on YouTube. And for whatever reason, the official called it good. That tied the game. And then in overtime, he kicked another one to win the game. So really, the Colts beat Lombardi's Packers in the heart of their reign, the greatest franchise ever, supposedly, the greatest team ever, the greatest coach ever. And they beat him with a running back at quarterback. Or so it seemed. The Colts felt cheated. So Shula showed what a brilliant, brilliant coach he was. He almost pulled this impossible dream off, and he didn't even need Unitas to do it. And so to me, it was the summit of professional football. That was where it hit its highest point.
Yeah, that playoff game, it was interesting for a whole bunch of reasons. I mean, not only did you have Tom Matty, basically, I think he was a third stringer, right, at this point, as quarterback for the Colts.
Well, no, he wasn't a third. He was a no stringer. He had not played quarterback for them at all. He was a running back.
But you even had on the side of the Packers, Bart Starr was injured as well, right? And Zeke Brakowski.
In the first play of the game, he got injured. Yeah.
Right. So I mean, talk about, and it's my understanding too that field goal, that controversial field goal that many claim was not a field goal. A couple of different things for that. One. The referee or the official running the game at that point is a guy named Jim Tunney, who most fans of the 70s NFL will recognize as probably the quintessential, the dean of referees, if you will. I think he was kind of the first.
That's exactly right.
Whose name I ever knew, to the point of like knowing actual referee names, right? To the casual fan, lots of people knew who Jim Tunney was. But then also too, it's my understanding too that decision or controversy even led to a change ultimately in the goalposts set up in the NFL.
Yeah, well, the goalposts were weirdly not uniform in those days. They were rickety. They looked like sticks that were thrown together. They were at the front of the end zone, and they were very short. So the next year, they made them more uniform. They started to look like the goalposts that we know today. And the goalposts were higher in the air, and they called them the Baltimore extensions because short for Baltimore got screwed, so we extended them.
I did not know that. There you go. See, I always learn something on these little I always learn something. It's pretty amazing.
Well, I made up the part about Baltimore got screwed, but they did call them the Baltimore extensions.
So. After, and arguably that could be looked upon as a successful, unsuccessful season, right? They go on to win with the playoff bowl.
Yeah.
So this is not a team that's floundering by any stretch of the imagination.
No, not by a long shot. I think they lost 3 games all season that year. I think two of them were 3 regular season games. 2 of them were to the Packers, and then they lost that playoff game to the Packers. So they were a dominating team, and they could barely move the ball in that playoff game. So after the game, Shula said, well, it really killed us to not have Unitas in there. But in reality, he showed everybody that he might not really even need Johnny Unitas at all. It was an unbelievable moment of triumph for Shula. There's no doubt about that.
All right, well, let's get into the latter years of this tandem here because some drama to come, right? Because 1967. Explain this to me because this is an interesting and amazing anomaly from what I can tell, right? You have a team that finishes 11-1 and 2 ties, right? What is the winning percentage of that? 9-17 or so, and they don't make the playoffs. How does that happen?
Yeah. Well, not only did they not make the playoffs, but they finished the season with the best record in football in either the NFL or the AFL, and they didn't make the playoffs. They went into the last game of the entire season still undefeated and didn't make the playoffs. So what happened is that they had weird tie-breaking rules in that era. The Colts had tied the Los Angeles Rams in Baltimore earlier in the season, and George Allen, who was the coach at that time, it's weird how it was almost like he had ESP or something. He says, well, this was actually a great game for us, and this tie was great for us because If we're still tied with the Colts at the in the last game of the season, whatever happens in that game, it will determine the champion of the division. Well, he had it all figured out in his head. He was exactly right. And as it turned out, the Colts and the Rams were tied. And the Packers played a key role in that because they had a game against the Rams the week before, and they had it all wrapped up, and then weirdly blew it and let the Rams win it in a miracle fashion. And so that's what made the Rams stay tied with the Colts or they weren't tied with the Colts, but they were in striking distance of the Colts to that last game of the season. So then it became a winner-take-all in the last game of the season. If the Rams won it, they would go to the playoffs, and if the Colts won it, they would go to the playoffs. So even though the Colts were undefeated going into that game, they had to win it just to make the postseason. They were 11-0-2, or is that right? Yeah, 11-0-2, and then they lost the game, and they ended up the season 11-1-2 and didn't make the postseason. It's incredible.
So this also goes into sort of the artificiality of the divisions and the conferences, if you will. Obviously, much more complex today, but I mean, to the point of the NFL even calling it the Western Conference, right? When last I checked, Baltimore was on the East Coast, and literally on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, right? So there's a curiosity sort of there looking backward, but then also this idea of arguably the two best record teams, in this I guess renamed Coastal Conference at that point.
Well, let me explain the Coastal Conference
please,
for a second. So what happened was, because the NFL was adding franchises in the 60s in order to keep a pace with the AFL and to strategically oppose them, so they were adding franchises, and so they decided that the NFL would be broken up into two conferences, an Eastern Conference and a Western Conference, and within those two conferences, there would be divisions, and so they came up with names like the Coastal and the Century, and there were two other names for these divisions. I forgot what the other two names were offhand. So then the playoffs were extended. It was no longer an East and a West meeting each other in the championship game. It was a round of playoffs before that, so that the champion of the East or the West could be determined from that playoff game. Then those two would play each other and in the NFL championship game, and then they would go on to the Super Bowl. So it all became very complex. And in 1967, not only did the Colts finish the season with only one loss, and they went into the last game of the season undefeated, but they beat both Dallas and Green Bay in the regular season. And so then Dallas and Green Bay went on to play for the NFL championship in that famous Ice Bowl game, but the Colts had beat them both in the regular season and didn't even make the playoffs.
Yeah, and Shula wins Coach of the Year his second time, and Unitas wins the MVP. This is the height of irony there, right?
Yeah, they won it all. They won everything but the championship.
So how does that go down in Baltimore, both the fan base as well as with the players and the coaches? And I mean, was Rosenblum just like apoplectic about all of this? I can't imagine this went down well.
No, I think just the opposite. I think that they were very, again, like going back to the kind of the mythology that got built up around all this, they were unlucky, In reality, Unitas went into that game against the Rams in 67 with a winner-take-all, and he laid an egg there. He had a terrible game, but everybody wanted to believe that the Colts were victims of bad luck only. And that was the only thing that kept them out, that these bizarre things kept happening to them, but they weren't really looking at what was happening on the field. They had to beat the Rams in the last game of the season. They knew it. The Rams knew it. Everybody in America knew it. It was super exciting, and they laid an egg, and they didn't win, and Unitas played poorly. So but instead of it being where Rosenblum was apoplectic, they didn't look at it that way. They looked at it like, well, eventually we're going to win this thing. We're going to get them next year. So what happened the next year? They went through the entire schedule and lost only one game again. Same deal. No ties this time, but Unitas was injured, and in the preseason, in a preseason game against the Cowboys. He could literally hear something pop in his arm. He could hear it, not feel it, hear it. And he was really out. Shula had known somewhere in the back of his mind something was wrong with Unitas before it happened, and he went out and got Earl Morrall from the New York Giants for nothing. The Giants were gonna cut him anyway, and Shula ended up getting him for literally nothing and brought him in, and he won 13 games and beat every team that had cut him over the years, and beat all the Colts, beat the Packers again, beat the Rams, beat all the Colts' old enemies, and won the MVP also. So the Unitas was MVP in '67, and Earl Morrall was MVP in '68, and they went zooming into the Super Bowl feeling like kings.
So, at what point during the '68 season does Unitas get back to what he might feel to be an ability to play again, or is he?
I mean, that's a good question, but because I think he was living in denial about that one, and so were the fans, and everybody seemed to harbor this messianic belief that Unitas was gonna be miraculously cured and come in and save them, but they didn't need a Messiah and they didn't need to be saved. Everything was going great for them, but they obsessed about how he was feeling and whether he was ready. He still was the center of attention. Now, when did he feel like he was ready to play again? He played in their only loss of the year against Cleveland. He was horrible. I think he threw 3 interceptions or something. I think he had more interceptions than completions. He only had something like 11 attempts, 3 interceptions, and I think maybe one completion or something atrocious like that. And he couldn't play. I went and spoke to an orthopedic surgeon about what he was experiencing then, and he said, well, he likely had a Tommy John style injury. And he said, but in those days they didn't have the equipment to be able to look in there and see what was exactly happening. That Tommy John surgery hadn't been invented yet, and if it had been, he would have gotten it and he would have been out for sure for at least one year. He said it's rare for a quarterback to get a Tommy John injury. It's more associated with a baseball pitcher, but that's exactly what he had. And a Tommy John injury is this point in the elbow where all of the muscle and the nerves kind of come to a single point, and it seemed to have been damaged for some time and then popped out of there. And so it was all just kind of flapping around. It was no longer attached to anything. So he really couldn't play. He didn't look good when he did play. And then, of course, as we know, he came in and played in the Super Bowl at the beginning of the fourth quarter, and he didn't play. Everybody's like, well, he got a touchdown. He took the team to a touchdown. They should have brought Johnny U in sooner. But he didn't look like a good player in Super Bowl III. He didn't have the arm strength.
Was he chafing, or were other people chafing on his behalf? To somehow get him back to play during the regular season and or the playoffs? Was everybody basically
more for the Super Bowl than anything else? I think that's where Shula apparently told a newspaper man, or a writer rather, not a newspaper man necessarily, but another writer, that Unitas had come to him before the Super Bowl and demanded to play, that he wanted to play in the Super Bowl, and he felt that his past accomplishments warranted it, and that he deserved it based on that. And Shula said to him, well, Earl deserves it. He was the MVP this year, and we're going to go with him. And I think that was one of the big, final breaking points in their relationship. But then, in the game itself, Earl played really abysmally. It was sad. He had such a good season, and he was such a decent man. He played terribly in the first half of the Super Bowl. They came back to him to start the second half. He couldn't do anything with the team. And so then Shula decided to bring Unitas in, which really the only thing that did was kind of bring second guessing onto Shula's head for the rest of his life. Because no matter how great Shula was and everything he accomplished, that was the one, smelly stain that he couldn't scrub out of his career, was that decision to leave Unitas on the bench supposedly too long. But the one person who debunked that for me was Joe Namath. He said, yeah, sure, he got a touchdown, but I mean, it's very late in the game, and do you think we're playing slightly different defense, knowing that we had a 2-score lead or actually it was a 3 scores, 3 scores the Colts would have needed. So don't you think we're playing different defense? Yeah, we're letting him do what he wants and let the clock tick. And Unitas, his craftsmanship on that touchdown drive, I can't remember how long it took, but it took extremely long. Tons of time went off the clock as the game was dying, and before they got that touchdown. And, the Jets were basically playing a form of prevent defense.
Well, I also want to remind our audience, in '68, right, the Colts were, really, I mean, there were some even calling them one of the greatest football teams ever at that point.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they demolished
no
the
doubt
Browns
about
in the NFL championship game, 34-zip.
And that was the only team they had lost to all in the regular season.
Right, and I think it's also important to, I guess you can't understate this enough. I think we all certainly know about the whole Joe Namath and the predicting of the win and all that kind of stuff, and the headiness of the AFL trying to finally equate themselves, even show that they are not only deserve to be merger partners with the NFL, but arguably as good, if not better, on any given day. The idea, right, that you can't underestimate. I don't know what the bookies had as odds. I don't even know if they had odds at this point, but maybe you can explain to the audience just how much of an underdog the Jets were and how heavily favored the Colts were in this third Super Bowl.
Well, I don't know about odds either, but they did have points, and the Jets were something like an 18.5-point underdog to the Colts. And the Colts just looked like a crusher, and the Jets were supposedly the champions of this schlep league, as Mike Curtis had put it. And to me, it's just baloney. And again, mythology. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The Jets had one of the greatest coaches who ever lived as their head coach. He knew the Colts in an unprecedented situation. I don't think any head coach has ever again known a championship opponent like Weeb Ewbank knew those Colts. He drafted and developed many, if not most of them. So he still knew that roster very, very well. He was a very bright coach, and Namath was already being looked upon by many people as the new best player in the game. Paul Brown said that weeks before the Super Bowl that he believed the Jets should be the Super Bowl favorite because of Namath. And nobody else in the league had Namath. They said, well, could he beat an NFL team? He said, absolutely he could beat an NFL team. And they asked Lombardi if Namath was good enough to be a star in the NFL. And Lombardi, this was weeks before the Super Bowl, unquestionably he's good enough to be a star in the NFL. So there were all of these components. But here was Weeb Ewbank's genius. He trained his players to run the game themselves. This was one of the reasons why he's not remembered as great. Lombardi looked like the great dictator, pulling the strings on everything, and Ewbank almost looked out of control out there, like he didn't have control of anything. But in reality, that was because he prepared his teams to win on their own, to control the game themselves. And Joe Namath, I don't know if you know this or not, but to this day, he's considered a superb play caller. He was considered to be an extremely bright quarterback and a great play caller, and they had a brilliant plan to beat the Colts that day, which was that defense. It was being hailed as one of the greatest defenses ever. It gave up something like 10 points a game for an entire season, and it looked like you couldn't beat it. Well, I'm sure Weeb looked at that defense, and he said, look, I have to pick my poison here. He looked at the one side, and it was Bubba Smith and Mike Curtis on that side, on the right side, and on the left side, it was Ordell Brazy and Don Shula were the end and the linebacker on the other side. Brazy and Shula were old veterans who were very, very good players, had long careers. They both went back to the 50s. And on the other side was Bubba Smith and Curtis, and they were the new breed. Big, fast, tough. So he had to decide, am I going to go after big, fast, and tough and modern, or am I going to go after two guys who are savvy and smart, but their time may be over? And he chose to go after the old men. It was a great choice because Snell ran all over them.
All right, well, let's go after that year into essentially what sort of came near the end, which was the 1969 season, which was the parting of ways for these two, right? Successful as they each individually. Maybe you can describe a little bit of the 69 season, maybe sort of what sort of transpired, and where they separately went on their own sort of merry ways. Neither of them necessarily in dire straits when you look at the rest of their careers, for sure.
Well, you can't just look at the two of them. You also have to look at Rosenblum too, because he's another key figure in this in all of this, but particularly in this final season. And he was really, I don't know, can your listeners take a little salty language, or should I clean it up?
No, go for it.
I mean, this isn't that bad, but he was very pissed, very pissed. So it was almost comical how gushy-lovey he was before the Super Bowl, and then how pissed he was after the Super Bowl. So before the Super Bowl, they're standing in the locker room. I guess they're in Cleveland. Tom Brookshire's there. You know, everybody's chomping on big fat cigars, and Brookshire is interviewing them. They're all calling him Brookie, and you know, and then finally Rosenblum gets interviewed, and he gushes on Shula. Oh, he says, you know, I always said that this was going to be my last head coach in the NFL, and it looks like that's what it's going to be. That Don Shula, he's a fine young man. You know, he just went on and on about how great he was. And then after the game, he basically never spoke to Shula again. He never spoke to Shula again. He sought out Ewbank and talked to him and told him that hiring Shula was the biggest mistake of his life, and firing Ewbank was the biggest mistake of his life. He admitted the scheme that took place to fire Ewbank and apologized, and he basically didn't speak to Shula anymore. And then, you know, in the season, Shula and Unitas could barely contain their contempt for each other during the season. At one point, you know, the team was never right for 1969 season. And at a certain point, he decided that it was all Unitas' fault that the team wasn't right, and he decided to sit him down for the Bears game, and he was going to start Earl Morrall, and Unitas. It appears as though he popped off to a reporter far out of town, somebody in Louisville where he went to college, and said that he wanted to be traded or else retire after the season. He didn't like the way he was being treated. Then later on, he denied it and, you know, kind of used it, you know, kind of smacked at the reporters for making things up. But it was obvious he was really mad. And then they go into that Chicago Bears game. Not only was Unitas on the bench, but one other interesting person wasn't present, and that was Brian Piccolo, who was a back for the Bears, who was in the hospital with testicular cancer, and they were trying to figure out what the problem was. But as you know, he became the subject of the Brian Song movie. But so not only did he leave Unitas on the bench, but the game, you know, didn't look good. The Colts weren't doing well on offense the entire game. So in the fourth quarter, with a chance to still win, they brought Unitas in and put Earl Morrall on the bench, and Unitas outfoxed Dick Butkus's defense. They all thought he was going to pass, and they were cheating to the outside to pass rush him, and he just bashed the ball up the middle over and over again until they scored the winning touchdown. And then in the locker room, they talked about how great Unitas was, and it really put a spotlight on Shula for putting him on the bench and creating all that turmoil. The Bears talked about how great Unitas was.
So where does Shula wind up going? How does he exit the team?
Well,
that done.
It looked like Shula was going to get fired at the end of the season. He had his worst season in Baltimore, and it didn't go well, and he was not on speaking terms with the owner. He was always barely on speaking terms with Unitas anyway, and there was a lot of tension between them, and it looked like he's going to be fired. So Rosenblum goes on vacation. He's out of the country, like in the Ernie, of course, he said it was the Orient. I don't know if that means he was in the Middle East or in Asia somewhere. but he was out of the country, and a newspaper man in Miami contacted Shula and said, "Hey, Joe Robbie's looking for a new head coach here. Are you interested?" So he said, "Sure." So then they called Rosenblum's son and asked him for permission, which they claim he granted. Shula goes down, takes their offer, which included an ownership stake in the Dolphins, and then Rosenblum comes back and blows his stack, says he got cheated and they stole his coach, and all of this, kind of drama ensued. But it was unbelievable what Shula pulled off here. He's on the verge of being fired in Baltimore, and instead he walked away with about the greatest deal any coach ever got, very similar to the one Lombardi got from the Redskins the year before, including the ownership stake, which was really key.
Well, it's also interesting, too, because in the immediate aftermath of them parting ways, Unitas sticks around. He's there for a couple more years, and lo and behold, what happens with the Baltimore Colts the very next season?
The very next season, they win the Super Bowl. And then the very next season after that, the Dolphins start a string of 3 straight Super Bowls, including 2 that they win. And they defeat the Colts in the AFC Championship game for the first of those Super Bowl trips. So as soon as those 2 part company, they both win titles. I asked every player if that was, I was like, did you realize this? They all professed to not even really have thought about it, and they all said that it was just a coincidence.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you given, especially given this this book and the focus of this, right? There's some kind of magic there, right? Whether it's adversarial or differing opinions, but under the same tent, if you will, to get the job done. That tension. That creative tension, if you will, maybe that has something to do with it. But you cannot deny that these 2 Hall of Famers, both of them, right, in their own manners, were together very interesting and on many occasions quite successful, and even separately. And I think it speaks to just how giant both of them were or are. Still both with us, thank goodness, in their contributions to the sport. And it's a pretty interesting a journey when you sort of describe the times that they were sort of together and perhaps headbutting, yes, but with some very interesting success together and certainly after the fact as well.
Tim, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, you really hit the nail on the head. I mean, I think everything you just said is exactly true. It's so interesting that they could push each other to such high heights, but there was some sort of a ceiling on it too, and they couldn't quite get to where they wanted to go. Part of being what I hope being a good writer, compelling writer, part of that is to create a narrative that really interests people, a flow to the story, if you will. And part of how I do that is, to raise the curtain a little bit on the writer is I think of like a key word that kind of permeates the entire book. And I also think of kind of a key idea that permeates the entire book. For me, the key word of the book was conflict. And it wasn't only Unitas and Shula's conflict, but I tried to show conflict all over the place in the book. The book is filled with all kinds of conflicts between those 2, between other players, between other teams and their coaches and quarterbacks, and also in society itself. And the phrase that I had in mind when I thought about all this is that really even great men will not succeed, will not achieve the things they want to achieve if they can't cooperate with each other. And on the other hand, I think there's nothing that men cannot accomplish and women cannot accomplish if they figure out how to work together. If they can't work together, they can't do it. And if they can work together, they can do incredible things together, like Bart Starr and Lombardi did.
All right, the name of the book is Collision of Wills, Johnny Unitas, Don Shula, and the Rise of the Modern NFL. It is available wherever fine books are found, and it is published by our friends at the University of Nebraska Press, and it's a great book. It's well put together. It's exceedingly well researched. There's some great photography in there. The dust jacket is delightful. All of those good things await you when you make that purchase. Like I said, wherever books are found, wherever you find great sports books. And of course, if you're looking for a place to purchase it and maybe give a little love to the show at the same time, well, by all means, just flip on over to goodseatsstillavailable.com, our website, and just search up this episode. I think it's number 84, our interview with Jack Gilden, and just click on the link there. There'll be a picture of the book, and there's a link to there's a text link to the book, whatever. That's going to take you to Amazon. You just click on through there. Maybe you get a little discount coupon in there, and we'll get a shekel or two of love for your doing so. And we appreciate that. And of course, any of the books or other forms of media or items that we mention here or think are related to the things we talk about, the topics on the show, you'll find a whole treasure trove of those on our website as well. So by all means, click early, click often, and make a couple of purchases. And we appreciate that. It's probably the least you can do for your pal Tim in helping keep this show going. We appreciate that. GoodSeatsStillAvailable.com. Not only will you find all the old episodes of this little show, Graham, but you will also find all of our social media links. On Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. You will find a Facebook page devoted to us. You can click to all those things from our website. You can also send some email to us. And if you want to send that directly without going to our site, fine, be that way. Just send that to hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Let's see, what else can you do on the site? You can sign up for our newsletter. We send out to various hundreds now, almost thousands right now, thousands of folks who have signed up to get our little alerts to let them know what content is out there this week and how else they can interact with the show. You can do that there too. Let's see. Well, I can't promote more than that, I guess, right? But again, goodseatsstillavailable.com. We appreciate you checking that out, and that's the absolute best way to keep on top of what's going on in the show. And last but not least, we of course need to thank our friend Jerry Payne, don't we? Of course we do. Jerry Payne, who just stays up late week after week, burning the midnight oil to put our little pieces together. And he, the chief cook and bottle washer for this show, editorially, production-wise, and of course his pals at Podfly Productions are worth your time as well. If you're looking to get into podcasting or just need some editorial or production assistance, you can do no better than to check out Podfly Productions. And of course, you can find them at, say it with me, podfly.net. All right, I am done for this week. Thank you so much for listening. Until next week, God bless you, and we'll talk to you again with another great episode, we hope. And again, thank you for listening. Bye, guys.